Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, brought to you today by Josh Edison and Dr. M. Dentith. Hello and welcome to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. I am Josh Edison, alone once again, because while I remain in Auckland, New Zealand, that wily Dr. M. Dentith is nowhere to be seen, at least around these parts. When last we heard, the good doctor was disappearing into a tunnel in North Head here in Auckland, and well, it seems like that tunnel might have gone a very, very long way indeed. I have received some correspondence from him in the form of an interview recorded with a friend of the show and subject of more than one episode, Brian L. Keeley. So M is at least in a position to be recording and reaching out to other people, so that's nice. But I'm still not much closer to figuring out exactly what's gone on here. So I think the best thing to do for our purposes is to simply play the interview. It's a good interview, and then close out on my thoughts and see where we go from there.
Hello and welcome. It's the 23rd of June, and I'm talking once again with Brian L. Keeley, philosopher and conspiracy theory theorist at Pitzer College, Claremont. Good afternoon to you, Brian.
Hey, how's it going, Em?
Oh, it's going well. I've been understandably a little bit bored the last few days, but I'm sure the boredom will pass. How are things in sunny LA?
Boring and hot, but that beats abject terror any day, I think.
Well, precisely. Although I suppose in the era of COVID-19, it's not so much the terror that terrifies us, but just normal people going about their lives just being ignorant as to what they really should be doing.
Yeah, like breathing.
Yes. Who would have known 2 years ago that breathing would be the deadliest weapon a human being could actually use? Yes, it's very, very disturbing. In fact, we'll be talking about COVID-19 later on in our discussion, because we're going to talk a little bit about that whole mature conspiracy theory thing and both of our attitudes towards COVID-19 conspiracy theories. But to engage in a bit of vain, glorious stuff with regard to the podcast first, now, you've been listening to the Conspiracy Theory Masterpiece Theatre episodes. Do you think we're doing justice to the early literature on conspiracy theory in philosophy?
So I will admit that I listened to it for a while and actually just went back today to see, because I knew I was behind in keeping up with it. And I see that the last one that I listened to was the Lee Basham ubiquitous I forget the actual title. Ubiquitous and Resilient, maybe, is the title, which was around a year ago, or maybe a year ago September. So I have fallen behind in my my podcast listening. I think part of the problem is that whereas most of my podcasts are just kind of fun, entertaining things, particularly the Masterpiece Theater it's actual, like, you do a really good job of actually summarizing things, including papers that I haven't had a chance to read yet. So, and even the ones that I have read, they were a while ago. So I actually have to kind of clear my decks and actually spend some time listening to it. I've got a road trip coming up soon, so I'm planning to catch up on a couple of them then, because I can just kind of concentrate on them and think through it. But yeah, I think you're doing a good job, and definitely a service of kind of getting the basic frameworks out on the table. And I am thinking that the next time I teach conspiracy theory stuff in the actual classroom, that it might be useful to, when I assign these particular papers, to also assign you and Josh kind of giving your précis of it and discussion of it. And because it's nice that you guys often, kind of add in a few points of debate and question and, issues that you want to have with the paper. And that could be a good starter to a conversation in a classroom or a seminar.
Yes, it's been quite interesting going back to the early literature and picking up on stuff which gets repeated later on, which kind of gets ignored for, say, a decade or so, or noting that people have consistently got people's positions wrong. for long periods of time, something which, of course, we've talked about a lot with respect to your work, with your 1999 paper of conspiracy theories, where kind of end up being the villain of the piece, despite the fact that you don't write a villainous paper in the first instance.
Yeah, and I think actually, I mean, I think you guys are pretty generous in your interpretation that, I have gotten misread but I think the blame is as much to me as to anybody else. And I think, as you point out, being one of the first people to kind of be talking about it meant that I hadn't quite figured out where the slipperiness would lie, and therefore the places I had to be careful when it came to being careful. And one of them is, I think, the point that you raise is this idea of beginning conspiracy theories, or the early days of a given conspiracy theory, as versus its maturity sometime on, as it gets older and it gets kind of investigated, or at least people begin to investigate it. And I think I must have just kind of stumbled into that in part because that original paper was on Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing. And that was a relatively new conspiracy theory at the time. And I was looking at some of the first kind of published conspiracy theories around it. But then the kind of standard conspiracy theories that we're kind of used to talking about, like JFK, or the JFK assassination, or the moon landing hoax, and the American intelligence agencies monitoring all transatlantic conversations. Those were quite old conspiracy theories at the time that I was writing. And even though I had examples of both new, immature and mature conspiracy theories, I had not, I think, fully picked up on what work was being done by the age of the conspiracy theory in each. Or at least I was allowing myself to slip back and forth without kind of noting that I was doing that, which led to confusion, I think.
Yes, I mean, the language thing, I think, is really quite fascinating here, for the sheer fact that when you're laying down the groundwork, as both you and Charles were doing with these initial forays into discussion about conspiracy theory, if you're not working with a pre-existing language, of course, you are having to kind of invent terms to try and describe the type of issues that you're trying to map. And of course, that first foray is going to be the kind of thing which, in retrospect, you might go, maybe I should have been slightly more cautious about these terms if I knew people were then going to follow up on this work and then write a lot of subsequent papers in the field.
Yeah, and I certainly at the time didn't, I didn't think it would take off the way that it took off. I mean, I think I thought of it. I mean, I think I mentioned in an earlier discussion with you, and maybe on the podcast, of when I, originally wrote it, was, somebody who was working in a completely different field of philosophy and was just looking for something that was, publishable on its own and that hadn't been done before. And that's why I picked this particular topic. And little did I know that conspiracy theories themselves, as well as the study of them, would blow up in years later. I mean, I'm happy that it happened, but yeah, it did not predict it. And if I had done so, yeah, I think I would have been a little more careful in laying things out.
Yes, I think this is actually something that Charles Pigton has also talked about, that his initial paper, Popper Revisited, was basically written to be performed or presented at a kind of graduate night, and then thought, I can actually probably send this into a journal as well. And then, of course, it, like your paper, was the pebble that started the avalanche in our discipline.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about that original paper and where people have got you wrong or got you right. So let's start off with kind of the crux of conspiracy theories, which is the talk of these mature, unwarranted conspiracy theories. What makes a conspiracy theory mature?
I mean, I think it can't be a matter of, the chronological age, because a new theory is a quite old theory could not, may not have been investigated very much, because I think, the level of maturity, the metric of maturity, has to be something like the amount of energy that has been put into investigating it. Something like, the Woodward and Goldstein conspiracy theories about Nixon being behind Watergate matured very quickly, right? I mean, you had two up and coming investigative reporters, you had inside sources, Deep Throat and others that were trying to get a story out. And, even though it took, looking back on it, we kind of sometimes forget how long that period of time was. It was, roughly, almost 2 years, I think, between the actual break-in and the resignation of Richard Nixon. So it was a couple of years that it took for that story to really kind of come to fruition. But to, go from an event to, and then very soon after conspiracy theories about that event to, the resignation of a president more or less admitting to the truth of the conspiracy theories, in a matter of 2 years, that's, that matured very quickly. Whereas I think, there are probably other conspiracy theories that did not receive a lot of attention at the time that they came about, or just there wasn't as much intense interest about them, such that, it took much longer for there to be investigations of them. And it's that degree of investigation that is the kind of maturing of a conspiracy theory as people start putting energy into determining whether or not it's got legs, and what the kind of anomalous data there is that needs to be pursued, what kinds of errant data, starting to track things down. Think about some investigations around criminal conspiracies. There are criminal conspiracies that people have been working on that are unsolved cases, and some of them are cold cases for many, many years, decades even, that maybe just not a sufficient resources were put to them to begin with. And so they mature much less quickly.
This actually reminds me of a comment that Charles Pigton once made to David Cody at a talk at one of the New Zealand philosophy conferences, which was kind of drawing a contrast between Elvis is alive conspiracy theories and JFK was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald official theories, going, well, look, there's been a lot of ink spilt on who killed JFK. It's been investigated in such rigorous detail that you really can say that we know what happened on that fateful day. And the Elvis thing, I mean, there are people who go around proposing that Elvis is still alive, but there's just nowhere near as much investigation into those conspiracy theories. And in part, that's because the death of a president is incredibly important. Whilst the death of Elvis was really important to his fans, but really didn't mean much for world history and indeed politics, which of course is usually the most important thing that happens within people's lives. And so that theory's remained largely uninvestigated, despite the fact that people point to, but there are all these books. Case of yes, but look at the mountain of books about who killed JFK.
No, that's definitely true.
So yes, I think you're right that maturity with respect to an unwarranted conspiracy theory kind of persisting in public discourse can't just be about how long it is. So, and I mean, this is where I think we bring in the COVID-19 conspiracy theories, because COVID-19's really only been with us for about a year and a half now. And yet I would say that most of the conspiracy theories about its origin, purpose, and transmission, the idea that it's not of zoonotic origin, it is a bioweapon being put forward by some malevolent government, and its purpose is bringing about a new world order, those theories matured very quickly, possibly within weeks or months of them appearing online. It kind of seems odd to refer to a conspiracy theory which seems fresh in the sense of it being completely brand new as something being mature, i.e. the kind of thing that we can look at with justified suspicion.
Although, because, I mean, it actually has some interesting, there's all sorts of interesting features of it that I think, and there's things that we've talked about and you've talked about on the podcast as well, of this idea that the way in which this particular conspiracy theory got folded in with others, right? I mean, people connecting it to things around 5G and cell towers and things like that, and people have even kind of made connections to Bill Gates, right? So there are aspects of it that, even though in some sense it was a new historical phenomenon, part of the conspiracy theories immediately made connections to earlier standing conspiracy theories, right? So if you already had your suspicions about Bill Gates, or you already had your suspicions about George Soros, that it kind of immediately got folded into those. So in those senses, or in those aspects of it at least, it takes on a level of maturity, because it's kind of, it becomes a piece of a larger conspiracy that has already gotten lots of investigation. Other aspects of it, right? I mean, things having to do with the potential stories about whether it was accidentally released or on purpose released by one government or another. Some of those aspects I thought were, are relatively new, and also ones in which I think, there is still a level of immaturity about it that we just can't say for certain. I mean, I'm actually kind of pleased with myself that there was an interview that I did with a podcast. Actually, it was a radio show early on. And I think it probably would have been around April of 2020, so fairly early in the thing. And when we were talking about conspiracy theories having to do with it, and one of the things I said at the time was, the conspiracy theories about its origin are still relatively immature, or there's lots of things that we at that point didn't know, and there are still things that we would like to know, and I think this is one of the reasons why we've seen the kind of recent resurgence in some sense of, and even at the official level with with President Biden in the U.S. calling on the intelligence services to reinvestigate, or to look back through their intelligence to see whether we can find anything now about the origins of it that we maybe missed in the midst of just trying to deal with it. Because in some sense it doesn't matter where it comes from. If you've got a virus that's out in the environment that's doing bad things, your first order of business is to try to get the virus under control, and then only later worry about, like, where did this come from? How do we stop the next one? And that's going to require things like figuring out, well, where did it come from? How did it get into the environment? What was its original source? Those are, it seems like now we've gotten to the point where returning to that seems to be an issue that at least some people want to reconsider. And I think part of it is because of the relative immaturity of that aspect of the story. Although I feel that it's going to mature very quickly in the next year, for sure, as we start throwing resources at it in a more concentrated way. And I think part of it also is just at least in the U.S. context, the shift from one presidency to another, which had very different kind of attitudes towards, both the potential sources of it and what it meant for their presidency. There's a way in which just the sheer handing off from one presidency to another means that, okay, at least a different kind of lens is going to be placed on it. A different kind of investigation is going to be taken about, just simply because the new administration in some sense might want to blame the previous administration for dropping the ball, whereas the previous administration would want to make sure that everything looked good for them. So at least then we can kind of at least get a new kind of investigation, or an investigation with new elements to it that will help with the maturity of the overall thing, such that, say, in a year's time from now, we can say, well, we had the Trump administration had its look at the origins, and then we had the Biden administration's look at its look at the origins. These are two very different approaches. Certainly, they had different things that they wanted to be true. So if there's any motivated belief going on here, they're at least countervailing motivated beliefs, such that whatever comes out as a result of the two investigations, or the two periods of investigation, are going to add to the general maturity of how we should feel about it, and whatever answers they come up with.
And indeed, this actually kind of reminds me of going back to 2003 and the whole weapons of mass destruction thing, because it seems that often what motivates investigations is either an epistemic challenge or a political situation. So, as you point out, if you're going from the Trump regime to the Biden administration, then you've got very different political goals with how you're dealing with a pandemic within your nation state. The Trump administration wanted to blame China for the entire state of what was going on in the US. The Biden administration's been much more interested, at least initially, with, oh, we've got to mop up the mess that was left behind by the last administration. And now we're going to look at the side question, which wasn't so important at the beginning of the pandemic, where we should be dealing with people being sick. Now we're going to look at how did we get to the point where people are being sick. And what's kind of interesting in the way that these investigations kind of start, or they get restarted with respect to the origin conspiracy theories about COVID-19, is the way in which a new data point can suddenly spur new investigation. So it seems that what really spurred the Biden administration to go hard on the lab leak hypothesis about the origin of COVID-19 was because a biologist by the name of David Baltimore wrote a report saying, oh, look, there's this smoking gun in the genome of the virus, which looks like it's actually been to some degree engineered through a gain of function thing, which means it must have come from a lab. That intelligence then got to the US. The US intelligence establishment then went, oh, we've got to do investigation into this. And then about a week later, the biologist in question then went, oh, I kind of misspoke. It's not really a smoking gun per se, because it turns out that this region of the virus's genome, which I'm taking to be a really, really big thing, actually that's found in a lot of viruses naturally anyway. So you probably shouldn't take so much from what I've said there. And that kind of made the lab leak hypothesis go from being relatively implausible given what we knew to suddenly something which was a political football, and then it's gone back to where it was, say, about a year ago.
Yeah, although I don't know, did you see there was a piece recently in the Atlantic? I'm actually was gonna look it up. Terry Gross on our National Public Radio interviewed the author, it's basically an investigative journalist taking a deep dive into the origin story and brings up the stuff about Baltimore, but also just, I mean, it's actually a much more interesting story in terms of geopolitics as well as biology, of kind of figuring out, like, just even the question of, like, how would you tell? It's not like somebody who creates a virus is going to sign it, the way they might sign a painting. Trying to figure out exactly what you would look for in order to to find the telltale signs of a human origin to it. It's part of it goes back to, my own interest in this topic of conspiracy theories comes out of an interest in philosophy of science. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about the COVID-19 story, whatever that story is going to be, it's ultimately going to be a scientific story, or at least in part a scientific story. It's also going to be in part a political story. But you run into all the problems that you have people have been trying to figure out the origins of viruses for quite a while, and figuring out, like, what animals do they come from? What leads them to, jump? We used to talk about the species barrier. We don't talk about that so much anymore, just because it turns out not to be as clear of a concept as one might have thought. But you run into all the problems you run in the sciences in general, and understanding how sciences go about establishing the claims that they have. So it kind of inherits all the problems of philosophy of science, and then kind of adds an extra layer of politics on top of it, just to make it more fun. So that's why I'm thinking it's a much more interesting story than than some of the other conspiracy theories that we might have that don't have anything to do with science at all, or aren't really scientific stories at all.
And also an interesting story for the sheer fact that I think the writer of the initial Vanity Fair piece on the David Baltimore allegations of the smoking gun was also one of the writers who pushed hard for Iraq having those weapons of mass destruction back in 2003. So there's also this worry that there are certain vested interests who want to be hawkish about overseas activities to then justify a kind of imperial response from the US. So as you say, the politics here becomes really quite fascinating.
Yeah, and there was a report, or I guess a letter, that came out right around the same time, I think, as the original Baltimore piece that you were just mentioning, saying that, hey, this, maybe it was even in some sense a reaction to Baltimore's soundbite that he had about it, saying that, hey, there's no chance that this is more than likely, we're a bunch of scientists and we can tell you it had a biological source. It was not man-made. And, oh, by the way, and we're just a group of uninterested scientists who just want to, get this out on the table. And then turns out that, some of the people, and particularly the person that was most behind getting this letter written and signed in the first place, turned out to have some conflicts of interest, like had actually, funded some of the laboratory that in Wuhan that had been fingered as a potential source. So and the original letter did not make clear those connections. So you get back to the some of the standard things that we often see around conspiracy theories of various levels of self-interest and lack of transparency that kind of, again, make the story a little more complicated than it seemed on the surface.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things which is going to be interesting about the COVID-19 pandemic and the conspiracy theories around it is that at the moment, when you're trying to both combat a virus and also deal with various origin, transmission, and purpose theories about COVID-19, there's a lot of information which is very hard to get to the bottom of now, which will make the study of COVID-19 much more interesting in, say, 10 years' time, where hopefully the pandemic is well gone, or we're used to living in a COVID being like a seasonal cold thing. But when you're in the middle of a pandemic, fighting on multiple fronts, not a very good idea.
No, exactly.
Now, moving away from the terror of the virus to the other kind of central point of your 1999 paper, which is after you talk about the problem of mature, unwarranted conspiracy theories, you then move on to talking about the kind of pervasive skepticism that continued belief in these mature conspiracy theories can lead to. And it seems that a lot of the writers on conspiracy theory who followed you kind of took it that you were advocating that belief in conspiracy theories generally leads to this kind of pervasive skepticism, and thus that is a reason to reject belief in conspiracy theories. But that isn't a fair portrayal of your view, is it?
No, and oh, by the way, just to throw this in, you're right. It was actually the Vanity Fair piece by Catherine Eben that I was thinking of that just came out about 2 weeks ago, I think. So, or I think it's Eben, but I just didn't want to lose that thought. So yeah, this is a topic that I'm currently trying to think through. As you point out, it's one of the other areas of contention around my paper. This idea of what's come to be known as the public trust argument, or this idea that we shouldn't that it's a knock against conspiracy theories and a reason for not believing in them, because if you believed in them, it would erode our public trust, right? That they are kind of this is the idea of conspiracy theories as being kind of a cancer in a society by causing people to be playing around with conspiracy theories instead of trusting, the authorities that they ought to be trusting. And that was, like I said, that was never the argument that I thought I was making in the original paper. I thought I was making the argument that was kind of the other way around, which is that in many ways, the only way that you can take certain conspiracy theories seriously, particularly certain mature conspiracy theories seriously, is if you had a pre-existing lack of trust, that it kind of presupposed a level of distrust. Not that it would necessarily lead to distrust, but that it's in some sense you have to have a high degree of distrust to take it seriously. Often because of the amount of work that must have been put into it, right? People have looked at this. They have not found evidence in favor of the conspiracy, and so the only way you can hold on to that conspiracy or take it really seriously is if you just discount all of that stuff that's been done. Like everybody's been lying up to this point, or everybody's been doing a shoddy job, or perhaps they had conflicts of interest and they just didn't want us to know the truth. And you know the when you think about, I mean, I thought about cases of things like the moon landing hoax. The number of people that would have to be in on that particular conspiracy, and with relatively little incentive to go ahead with the hoax, if it is indeed a hoax, seems to involve a pretty negative view of of the people that are involved, that they would be so willing to lie so easily. And it's like, okay, that requires a pretty significant degree of public distrust. The ironic thing is that even though that wasn't the argument, the public trust argument is not the one I thought I was making originally. These days, I actually find myself kind of being more interested in the argument that I was accused of holding, and maybe find it a little more plausible than I did then. And that's the idea of the use of conspiracy theories as disinformation campaigns, or as parts of disinformation campaigns. That at least we have some reason to believe that conspiracy theories as a phenomenon in the West may be in a case where it's being promoted by parties that wish to undermine the public trust. That there's a general sense that if you can get people really taking conspiracy theories seriously, then they aren't going to trust people on other things. For instance, if you can, it might be good for certain people in the world that the U.S. not vaccinate itself against the new virus. So if you can do something that kind of generates distrust about vaccines, then you can make sure that the U.S. is going to be kind of held back by its lack of vaccination. So I mean, I think there's a role of conspiracy theories in public trust. There's clearly a connection between the two. And one of the things that I'm kind of actively looking at these days is kind of revisiting that argument and saying, basically that wasn't the argument that I thought I was making before. And I think there's a reason why in 1999, it probably wasn't necessarily an argument that was very sound, in the sense that there weren't forces perhaps pursuing a disinformation project. Although that's not completely clear. I mean, the KGB and the CIA were kind of had combating, were fighting on the stage of misinformation for quite a long time during the Cold War. So maybe it's naive to think that this is a relatively new phenomenon, but that nonetheless, that it seems to be something that's kind of worth looking into to see, what is the role that conspiracy theories play on the public trust, and what are the implications of that?
I mean, certainly we saw with the Trump administration the labeling practice of calling information the president didn't like as fake news was very much a mis or disinformation campaign coming out of the White House to either distract people from news which was bad, or to undermine trust in traditional sources and make people trust, say, the president and his team moreover. So yes, there is obviously something about the labeling practice of calling something a conspiracy theory, which can then lead to a pervasive erosion of trust over time. But I was also thinking, going back to the Elvis example, One of the interesting things, say, about someone who sincerely believes that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone and that there was a coterie of people on the grassy knoll made up of the FBI, the CIA, Cuban rebels, Russian mafia, and the like, all shooting at JFK at the same time to get their bullet in. This is the kind of person who believes that actually Elvis Presley is still alive and is recording music to this day. Is that you could go, well, look, given the amount of investigation that's gone into the JFK assassination, if you believe that it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald, or it was Lee Harvey Oswald and all these other people, there's a whole bunch of other things that you've got to kind of give up to be able to maintain that belief. Well, conversely, with the Elvis is alive conspiracy theories, which have not been investigated to the same extent, you can believe that without actually giving up much else about the world. Because all you're doing is going, well, I just believe he's alive and recording music. It doesn't actually say anything about politics or world history or governments being complicit in covering these things up over time. It's just one man faked his death, probably with the help of his family, and then went on to lead a new life. So the fact that the Elvis theory isn't mature in the same way that various JFK conspiracy theories are means that you have different levels of skepticism about things generally in the world around you.
Yeah, and I think there might be also kind of what you're pointing to is this kind of connection between skepticism in general and the maturity, right? That if the metric of maturity has to do with the degree of effort that's put into the investigation, that is going to mean that less mature theories are just connected to the rest of the epistemic network far less or far more tenuously, right? It's just, there's less going on there, and therefore, it's much more compartmentalized. I mean, again, thinking back to in the case of science, right? There are certain counterfactual claims that have been, investigated, and I think here of somebody like Lakatos, with this idea that that different ideas in science, different claims in science have a different degree of centrality to them, right? And that some, if you want to call the law of gravity into question, right, that's, if that were to be false, right, or the implications, the downstream implications of the falsehood of that claim, of the law of gravity would be monumental, right? I mean, so much of science would have to be rewritten if it turned out that was was false, which is why Einstein was so monumental, right? Is it's like, when you mess with things that fundamental, right, it means significant revolutions in science that go out and affect many things. Whereas if you are somebody who thinks that the claim that, say, stress causes ulcers, it may be false, and that instead it's being caused by a microorganism, right? That kind of claim is much less central, right? You would have to change certain ideas about the immune system, perhaps, and about the digestive system. But unlike the law of gravity, that's a much more constrained set of claims and a much more constrained set of connected claims, such that change that will get you a Nobel Prize. But you're not going to be picked as the most important scientist of a century the way that Einstein was, because falsifying that claim is important, but not nearly as connected to so many other things, and therefore requiring a kind of a revolution. And I think the same sort of thing can be said for different conspiracy theories, and often maturity is related to that. As you say, not much is going to follow from discovering that Elvis Presley is actually alive, or at least lived longer. Instead, we worry about what if JFK was assassinated in a different way, that might have massive impacts on geopolitics.
Yes, I think there is something really quite interesting about the way that relative maturity affects relative skepticism if we're going to go down this particular path. We've kind of dealt in the past here with 1999 and your paper, although you've talked about how you're now looking as to how you're going to take those arguments from 1999, the way that people have looked at your arguments from 1999, and maybe rehabilitate yourself to a certain extent in the literature by reframing this debate around the kind of misinformation, disinformation thing. And of course, this has all been a discussion in social epistemology, the way that as social beings active in communities, our knowledge is very much dependent on learning things from other people and transferring that information along. But there's also a question as to what other avenues in philosophy can the interest in conspiracy theory actually lead to. So there are obvious connections with epistemology, given we're talking about knowledge claims. But what other connections can we make in philosophy to say things like ethics or metaphysics, do you think?
Yeah, this is, I mean, something I've been thinking about recently, and I'm also kind of curious to hear what you have to say about it as well. But yeah, as you say, the kind of the source of thinking about conspiracy theory or conspiracy theory, at least within the context of philosophy, has come out of epistemology, right? It's a, I mean, and I think this has a lot to do with this idea that that both Charles and I kind of pushed on early, is this focusing on the theory aspect of conspiracy theory, right? Noting that it's not just a way of speaking, but then there really is something theoretical, explanatory in the kinds of conspiracy theories that we're interested in. And so that, and I mentioned earlier, that I was coming at this from a perspective as a philosopher of science. So I was interested in kind of scientific explanations and some of the stuff that I've written about conspiracy theories afterwards kind of compare scientific explanations and religious explanations with conspiratorial explanations, and just, kind of focus on that explanatory and knowledge and understanding aspect of conspiracy theories. But now that more and more people are getting interested in conspiracy theories more generally, as we know, all these people outside of philosophy, the political scientists and the economists and the cultural theorists and the historians and the kind of this idea that conspiracy theory isn't just philosophy anymore. It's now lots of different psychologists and neuroscientists and all these different people involved. That I think with that comes this idea of well, who else in philosophy may want to kind of get in on thinking about conspiracy theories? And in at least in when I think of philosophy more generally, or when I'm giving talking to my intro philosophy students in my first year seminars or whatever, I kind of tell the story of there's kind of three main branches of philosophy. There's metaphysics, what is there, what exists, what sorts of things are in the universe, and what's our ontology, what are the things that are there to talk about. And then that's metaphysics. And then the second area is epistemology, which is what can we know about those things, right? What knowledge can we have? How do we titrate our level of belief to any particular claim? How to think about the difference between truth and fiction, and those sorts of things. And then the third area, so you got metaphysics, you got epistemology, and then the third area is kind of the more general area of value theory, of what's good, what's beautiful, and that's where you get your ethics, that's where you get your aesthetics, your judgments, right, of good and bad, right and wrong, those sorts of things. And obviously all three of these are connected, but they kind of constitute the three kind of big areas of philosophy. And so if the epistemic is the original source of conspiracy theory, right, what is there for metaphysics and value theory to do? And this is, like I said, something I've been thinking about for a while. I mean, one of the metaphysical issues that I think that comes up is just getting our heads around exactly, what sort of a phenomenon is a conspiracy, right? It's a social phenomenon that seems to has certain features. It seems to require more than one person, more than one agent. But as one of the things that I've been interested in when thinking about religious explanation is, can if God does it on his own, and we're monotheists, right? Then is that by nature by its very nature something which is then can't be conspiratorial, right? Because it's being done by it's the ultimate lone gunman, right? If God does it by himself. Well, that's the thing, right? Is like, first of all, it forces you to think, thinking about conspiracies and the relationship to religion raises these kinds of metaphysical questions of like, well, is that the right way to think about God? Would that problem go away if you had a non-monotheistic view of God, or if you even your monotheism involved these different, three persons in one God kind of idea. So I mean, I think, part of it is just like, okay, well, what is really, what are the essential aspects of or essential elements of a conspiracy? Is it that it be done by one, or is there something else about it? Is the secrecy component the more important component? Is the nefariousness of it the more important thing? Right. And so getting at the kind of metaphysics of what sort of a thing is a conspiracy, what are its features? These are, I think, some kind of interesting metaphysical questions that come up, and the relationship. What kinds of beings are required to participate in the conspiracy, right? How much foreknowledge do you have? How much sentience do you need to have, and so forth. So, getting clear about these metaphysical issues, I think, are interesting, and even these questions about whether conspiracies are really about explanations at all, right? Because a number of people who've critiqued work in the philosophy of conspiracy theories kind of really push on this idea that, Charles Pignon and I started out with this idea that it's all about explanation, that we really concentrated on the theory aspect of conspiracy theory, but maybe it's a different kind of a speech act altogether, right? It really isn't an attempt to explain anything. Maybe it's a signal of tribe membership, right? It's more when somebody participates in conspiracy theories, or at least an important segment of people who perhaps participate in conspiracy theories aren't really in it for the explanations and knowledge claims at all. They're thinking of it as being a way of identifying who they are and whose team they're on, whose tribe they're in, and so forth. That maybe, Charles and I have gotten the wrong end of the stick from the very beginning, because metaphysically we took conspiracy theories to be ultimately something epistemic and explanatory. Maybe it ought to have been in a different category altogether. It should have really been philosophy of language that we should have been doing or calling upon, not Hume and works of epistemology. And I think there's also all sorts of obviously interesting things to be thought of in terms of the epistemic realm, right? This idea of conspiracy theories as problems, right? Is there a problem associated with conspiracy theories? The public trust story that we were just talking about being one aspect of it. But as we've seen in other cases as well, right? There was a famous paper on the ethics of belief. This idea that that there is a normative component to holding certain beliefs, that it's not it isn't that epistemic considerations are completely divorced from ethics. What you believe can have important impacts. If you are somebody who believes that your ship is the ship that you own is seaworthy, and in fact it isn't seaworthy, and you send a group of sailors out to their death because you had the wrong belief, right? There might be ethical implications to that maybe I ought to have investigated more to find out whether that belief was actually a good belief, that maybe or maybe I was acting through prejudice and so forth. That I think we see this especially in the cases of the things revolving around people like Alex Jones and the Sandy Hook shootings, where you have somebody who is saying, hey, I'm just investigating a conspiracy theory that maybe there were crisis actors and no children were actually hurt. All sorts of ethical issues come up of, well, okay, but if you're wrong, you're causing a great amount of pain to somebody who's already experienced a great amount of pain. They've lost a child in a shooting, and now you're calling into question whether that child ever even existed. And you're forcing somebody to, or you're trying to get them to produce a death certificate to prove that their child was actually killed, right? There's all sorts of kind of moral implications of like, well, yes, you're asking a question, but there's an ethical dimension, a normative dimension to the questions that you're asking, right? If you ask questions in an inappropriate way or in an inappropriate context, that may be doing more harm than good, that you're not showing sufficient humility in your question asking. So yeah, I'm just kind of interested in these other ways in which conspiracy theories intersect with philosophy that aren't just about epistemology, just aren't about them being theories. And kind of curious also just to hear what you think of like other aspects of philosophy that should be brought in or could be brought in when thinking about this phenomenon that we've been thinking about for the last decade or so.
Well, yes, I mean, as we've seen with, say, the work of Pat Stokes, which has kind of looked at the ethical dimension of what it's like to be a particularist around conspiracy theory and doing the whole, look, there are consequences to the just asking questions mode, which is that you're kind of sometimes actually covertly making assertions about people doing unethical acts. And there probably is a kind of norm that says maybe you shouldn't engage in those kind of speech acts without actually having enough evidence. It's not enough to go, I'm just asking questions. You kind of need overwhelming evidence before that licenses making claims of, I think maybe Prince Charles was responsible for the death of Princess Diana. If you want to make that claim, you should have really good evidence rather than just mere suspicion. Now, of course, the issue, as people have pointed out with Stokes's position, is that there are certain people in the world who are allowed to make those allegations. Police officers, when they're investigating crimes, are allowed to merely suspect that maybe you murdered your wife, and we're going to bring you in for questioning now. And maybe the courts then exist to kind of mitigate that by giving you name suppression during the investigation. But there's still a serious allegation being made against you. But we take it that these people are licensed in just the right way. So yeah, I mean, there are kind of interesting issues around the ethics of belief there and what kind of licenses and doesn't license allegations. I mean, on the metaphysics part, I think what's kind of interesting about all of the work in philosophy, I say all of it, probably most of the work in philosophy on conspiracy theory, is a lot of it starts with definitions. So a lot of it seems to start with a little bit of conceptual analysis, which we typically take to be kind of a form of analytic metaphysics, where we're defining our terms to go and look, by conspiracy theory, we mean the following. So even though we're doing epistemology, we're doing a bit of metaphysics first in order to then go, look, if we accept the following definition, so we take it, this is the metaphysical state of affairs, then the following epistemic analysis is naturally the consequence of this thing. And of course, Martin Orr and I, when we wrote our paper, Secrecy and Conspiracy, we kind of did a metaphysical analysis of what is the secrecy component of conspiracy, because we just typically take it that a conspiracy is two or more people working in secret towards some end. But there actually had been very little discussion as to, but what do we mean by working in secret here? Keeping secrets from whom? How many people? How long do we keep the secret for? If something is a kind of open secret, do we still consider it to be conspiratorial? So there is some work to be looked at with kind of fleshing out that definition of what both a conspiracy is, which I think most people are going to say are things that do occur within the world, although I sometimes think that some of the generalist analyses of belief in conspiracy theories are almost committed to a metaphysical view of the world where conspiracies never happen at all, given the way that they talk about conspiracy theories in this really, really pejorative gloss. But the question is to what conspiracy theories are. Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting notion there. But to kind of move beyond that, we talk about the value theory generally stuff. So I think there's probably some really interesting work to be done in the aesthetics of conspiracy theory with their their presentation, the way that they work, what makes them pleasing, what makes certain conspiracy theories the kind of thing that people will pick up and move with, versus the kind of conspiracy theories that people kind of glance at and go, no, I'm not going to buy that for $1 at all. And I know that there are some people outside of the domain of philosophy who are looking at aesthetic notions of conspiracy theory. I'm kind of tangentially involved in an art project that's going on in Lund in Sweden at the moment, where they did a exhibit of moon landing hoax memorabilia and photos, and they then had a guidebook associated with the exhibition, and I wrote a short piece on that about space conspiracy theories, their history, and where they come from, which allowed me to then do a long diatribe about the film Capricorn One, which is often taken to be the kind of the perfect example of why the moon landing conspiracy theories became big again, was when we saw a fake faking of a Mars landing, and people went, but that looks like the moon landing, so we can fake that in a studio. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of aesthetic stuff which I think would be really interesting to get into as well.
No, I think it's also interesting. It's, there's the precursor to a lot of our current interests in conspiracy theories goes back to the idea of urban legends, right? People don't talk about as urban legends as much now. That was a big thing in the 80s and the 90s, even though some of the conspiracy theories that we talk about now actually just are urban legends, just kind of dressed up in a new way. But urban legends were a big thing when Dawkins originally proposed his idea of the meme, right? And the original idea of the meme as coming out of evolutionary theory, and then thinking about, just as there are things which make genes adaptive, such that a gene will kind of, there's the phenotypic traits that are associated with a gene are going to be the things that are going to lead to its being replicated in a situation of natural selection. His idea, well, the same thing happens in the cultural world, except now we're going to talk about memes and not genes. But there's always going to be, what is it that makes a particular meme catchy, right? What makes an earworm, an earworm in songs, a nice hook or having a beat. It might not even be something that you like, but you just can't get it out of your head. Or, the same thing, you can't, you may not actually like a particular meme, but you kind of can't stop yourself from repeating it to somebody and telling them about, oh, this horrible thing I heard. And then now it's in their head and they're going to pass it on to somebody else. And this seems like an area, at least when people were talking about memes and urban legends, there was a lot of kind of conscious thought about the aesthetic components, right? Because that's, why is it that certain memes are going to be replicated? Well, they must have some rhetorical or aesthetic value that people are picking up on. And then that means, they're going to replicate them. But I think similar sorts of things can be said about and asked about conspiracy theories. I think that's interesting of what makes a particular conspiracy theory catch on and be the sort of thing that kind of gets legs, as it were.
And of course, the wonderful thing about talk about urban legends is it actually allows us to then talk about the kind of recurrent nature of these things. So we talked about how many COVID-19 conspiracy theories actually end up either being the resurgence of, say, a yellow peril conspiracy theory, or an adaptation of the existing 5G conspiracy theories that were around for a long time, well, say, around for a few years before the pandemic occurred. And of course, what's interesting about urban legends is that they are effectively just modern forms of folklore. They're the contemporary form of a traditional tale. I used to when I used to teach the critical thinking course at the University of Auckland, we do an entire section on urban legends and how urban legends kind of function as a way of giving moral messages. So when you have the urban legend of the babysitter who's left at home and there's a call that comes from within the house. And you go, well, look, this is the case of if you trust your children with a complete stranger, these things are going to happen. In the same respect, when you had the urban legends about children playing in sandpits and then accidentally stabbing themselves with a heroin needle, leading to an overdose, that was a story that never occurred. No one's ever been able to track down a case where that actually happened. But the story functions as a way of telling people, look, investigate the environment your children are going to be playing in. They're just these recurrent narratives.
Or just the superiority
over time.
of private play pits to public ones.
Well, yes, that too. Although, admittedly, if you're rich enough, you also might have heroin needles in your child's play pit as well.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the places where this comes up recently is the recent conspiracy theories around the blue lasers that are causing wildfires, right? And I think there has to be something to the fact that it's not just blue lasers, but they're Jewish blue lasers. The Jewishness has nothing to do with the story. But I think it has everything to do with its replication, right? I mean, the fact that it's, the story is put in terms of Jewish blue lasers, then suddenly people want to talk about it, if only to make fun of it, right? It's like, because there's a level of absurdity with adding in, that somehow it's connected to Jewish conspiracy theories or Israel or something like that. It's like, that gives it that little extra oomph that, you can, if it had just been space lasers, or lasers would have been one thing, but then you make them space lasers. Okay, that's interesting. And Jewish space lasers, right? Since it's like, it almost reminds me of the kinds of stories or the kinds of rules of thumb that people give fiction writers, right? That's exactly the kind of advice, if you're going to talk about lasers in your story, make sure they're Jewish space lasers, because you want to give it a kind of a specificity and a particularity, because that sticks in people's minds better, right? And these are kind of the advice that you give fiction writers or joke writers, right? It's like, how do you make your joke land better? How do you make your joke, what's the button that you need to put on your joke in order to really make it kind of, funny and memorable, right? I think some of the same aesthetic features that we see in joke writing and narrative fiction writing are the sorts of things that you're going to see in conspiracy theories, or at least those conspiracy theories which end up having more legs.
And also what's interesting there is, of course, it gives you a kind of cultural context as to who people think the threat is. Because when we had, I say we, in the Southern Hemisphere, when Australia had their massive burning season last summer, the big conspiracy theory there was also about space lasers causing the fires. But the culprits weren't the Jews, it was the Chinese. It was the Chinese space lasers that were causing those fires. So you still have the specificity, and you've still got the let's go with an old threat here. But you also have in the cultural context of, say, people who are worried about economic expansion by different powers. You go, well, who's our most local threat? We're going to blame the Chinese for what are obviously fires which either occur naturally because Australia is a country where gum trees explode in high summer heat because they want to, and also a few cases of what turned out to be actual arson as well. But definitely not space lasers. And even if they were space lasers, probably not Chinese space lasers.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there's a kind of nice rounding there that actually, even though I don't think that conspiracy theories and urban legends are one and the same, because I do think conspiracies occur, also I don't think that children get randomly stabbed by heroin needles in sandpits and public playgrounds, the recurrent features of certain of these stories, which kind of allow us to judge their maturity to a certain extent, is actually a really interesting aesthetic feature. And there probably is a fairly decent paper to be written looking at doing that comparison and the disambiguation to kind of get us to the root as to why there are certain conspiracy theories that we kind of just see and go, no, I've seen that one before. and I'm rejecting it, or I know why people are adopting this one because it's a really popular hit from the 1950s that's been repackaged with a drum and bass beat.
Yep. Or just, and I think part of it is now that we're paying more attention to it, I'm hoping that we're going to get more data on, the conspiracy theories that didn't take off, right? I mean, or being able to, to track them through time and figure out, like, at what point did this particular conspiracy theory take off, right? Or even within different subcultures, right? Like, when did this group of people start paying attention to this particular thing? And like you said, kind of the same way that we can do, musicologists do with music, right? Of tracing trends and so forth through time and being able to kind of spot the Bo Diddley beat as it's, transformed from era to era, from an origins in a, particular cultural context. Being able to do that sort of thing with conspiracy theories, I think, is going to be interesting now that we're, people are paying more attention to it, so that we can, get some more data on it.
And also, we also live in a kind of golden age for being able to track these things. So if you were trying to track conspiracy theories that failed to take off in, say, the 1930s or 40s, actually it's going to be very hard to find them in the first place, let alone see why there was no reaction. Given that so many conspiracy theories originate online now, we can kind of find that first instance and then go, all right, so why did this one, which seems remarkably similar to this really successful variant here, why did this not take off? Or conversely, and I think this is where QAnon becomes interesting. If you look at the history of the Anon accounts pretending to be high-level entities in the American government, why was it the QAnon roleplay that became the really big thing, and not all the other Anons doing similar things around about the same time? And you can then look at, what actors are involved, how are these things spreading? Is it a case of in the other Anon account cases, everyone was kind of in on the joke and they realized there was a role play? Or maybe with the QAnon one, maybe there were one or two people who came in who didn't realize the rules of the game and then spread it elsewhere. We can kind of diagnose how these tendrils work, and it might give us a better idea as to why some of these things spread and some of them just wither on the vine.
But yeah, I think you're right.
Which means that there's a lot of exciting work to be done.
Yeah, and I think your element, bringing in the aesthetics or rhetoric. I mean, that's a kind of interesting area that doesn't get a lot of attention these days. But the kind of the rhetoric of conspiracy theories and the rhetorical features, I think, are an interesting area that hasn't gotten enough attention.
So we've talked a lot about the past. We've talked a little bit about connections with other areas in philosophy, but let's now talk about the future. So put on your academic robes, pull out your academic crystal ball, and use your California sanctioned scrying ability to tell me where we should be going in the future in the study of conspiracy theory.
So yeah, I think, the big development there's been two big developments in thinking about conspiracy theories from a philosophical point of view since, Charles and I did our thing at the end of the last millennium. And first of all is this idea that, there's so many more philosophers that are interested, and we just talked about the different ways in which philosophy could get involved. It's not just about epistemology anymore. I think you're right. There's aesthetics, there's metaphysics, there's all sorts of ethical issues that come up. And so one of the things I'm looking forward to is that just kind of, getting beyond the old stories about, whether or not conspiracy theories should be believed or not, whether they're warranted or not, and, what goes into that. I think, still stuff to be done there, but I think there's lots of other interesting philosophical stuff to be said about conspiracy theories. But I think the other big development is that not only are there more philosophers paying attention to conspiracy theories, there's just more academics in general paying attention. The nice thing that we have now is this kind of wealth of investigators from a variety of different fields. Just mentioned the possibility of rhetoric, but there's history, political science, economics, cultural history, psychology, neuroscience, all these different areas of people that are interested in conspiracy theories. And I think what's going to be incumbent upon philosophers are to kind of engage with that larger literature, that that recognizing that this, the study conspiracy theory is an interdisciplinary or a transdisciplinary endeavor, right? That there's this interesting social phenomenon that, just as if we want to study something like religion, sure, there's philosophy of religion, and there's lots of philosophy to be done about religion, but to try to do a study of religion and not pay attention to the sociology of religion or the anthropology of religion or the politics of religion, the history of religion, right? All these things are things that need to be folded in to our discussion. And I mean, I think that philosophers so far have been a little slow on the uptake of that. They're starting with the philosophical literature, but I think the thing that I'm really looking forward to in the next couple of years is what happens when philosophers start to get into the fray with academics from other disciplines, and we start to kind of, use our philosophical skills to talk with and to interact with computer scientists and people who are doing digital humanities and all the other sorts of things that are kind of, I mean, in our conversation we've been having today, right? A lot of those issues are issues that come from outside of philosophy. And to me, that's, what's really super exciting, and probably has something to do with the fact that my day job, when I'm not thinking about conspiracy theories, is being a cognitive scientist. I'm a philosopher who thinks a lot about the mind, who thinks a lot about how the senses work. And when I think about the senses, I have to engage with the neuroscience of the senses and the psychology of the senses and the anthropology of the senses. And there's this entire field now called sensory studies, which brings together people from a variety of different fields that are all interested in this phenomenon of how we perceptually perceive the world. It's this cool, very interdisciplinary endeavor. And the thing that excites me most about conspiracy theory is that it's maturing as an area of study, such that now there's a lot of people playing the game and are investigating things, and I'm going to be very interested to see how that feeds back into philosophy and how philosophy can feed into it.
Yes, I do think that interdisciplinary work is kind of the future, because at the moment I think there's a lot of work happening in silos. As listeners are probably not aware, Brian is part of the Conspiracy Theory Theorist Social Club, which is a 3-weekly meeting where we read papers, discuss papers in conspiracy theory. We're not just looking at the philosophical literature, we're looking at the literature more generally, from sociology to cultural studies to media studies to social psychology. And what's always interesting about reading these papers is the vast amount of siloing that's happening within every discipline which is writing on conspiracy theories at this time, in that most social psychologists are not citing sociologists and philosophers. Most cultural theorists aren't citing, say, philosophers, although they might be citing sociologists. There's a lot of people working within their own epistemic bubbles, effectively. And we need to kind of broaden that discussion, because if the social scientists are right and conspiracy theories are a problem in need of a solution, then they should be drawing on what philosophers are saying and either arguing against us or pointing out where we go wrong and where we go right. And in the same respect, if philosophers are going to go around saying, actually, conspiracy theories are not quite the problem you think they are, then we need to be addressing our work towards the social psychologists and the like who are saying, no, but it is a problem, so that we can at least come to terms as to how we're going to resolve this particular tension in the broader academic literature. And I mean, to blow my own horn to a certain extent, being involved in Karen Douglas's project over at the University of Kent, which starts up later this year, is quite nice, of being the philosopher who's been invited into a project in social psychology. Because obviously Karen has gone, look, we do need to bring other people into this discussion to make sure that whatever we produce there's at least going to be some reason for people outside of our discipline to go, oh, I should have a look at that.
I agree.
And this does make me think that maybe a new collected project, so a new book of new work in conspiracy theory, going along some of these avenues of investigation, is something I should be looking at proposing later on this year. So keep your schedules open. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay, sounds good.
Well, thank you, Brian. That has been a wide-ranging and incredibly good conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it as well, and I hope the listeners have taken things away from this, or make them realize that the academic discussion of these things is a lot more complicated than sometimes we make it out to be.
Nope. Thank you very much. No, it was a great conversation. I wish you luck with the rest of the quarantine. Hopefully it stays boring and doesn't get exciting for any reason. And then good luck with the new position. Looking forward to hearing how it all settles out.
So am I. I'm also looking forward to the point where borders reopen and maybe we can meet up again in person.
Wow, that's an amazing idea. We should try that sometime.
Well, yes, because I mean, we did have that proposed writing retreat that we were going to do last year, and unfortunately, this pesky COVID-19 kind of made that a non-starter. But I'm thinking maybe sometime next year, a writing retreat in the mountains might work out after all.
Okay, yeah, let's think about it.
We just have to hope that another virus doesn't jump into the human species, because frankly, as people have been pointing out, it's kind of remarkable that we went so long between the Spanish flu and COVID-19. The next one's probably going to occur a lot sooner than many of us would like it to.
Yes, well, hopefully the mRNA virus framework will help us with that, but we'll have to see.
Well, yes, and actually my hope is that now that we've got an mRNA vaccine for one particular coronavirus, maybe we could finally get around to wiping out the common cold.
That would be nice, but I'd like to get rid of polio first, but
Oh, you and your priorities about diseases which are worse than the common cold. I mean, really.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brian. That has been a pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Em.
And there you have it. An interesting interview to listen to. I think it's particularly nice, given the amount we've talked about Brian's work and the amount we've talked about other people talking about Brian's work, to actually hear him put forth his own views in his own words and set the record straight, as it were. It was interesting. The point about comparing the death of JFK to the death of Elvis and the sort of the different effects on them is a good point. But I always think that the more interesting comparison is the shooting of JFK versus the shooting of Ronald Reagan, because there the events are much more similar. And could have probably gone either way. Like I think a lot of people perhaps don't realize just how badly Reagan was injured. They certainly tried to play it down at the time, but he took a bullet to the lung, and was in surgery, and there was a very real chance, I think, that he may not have survived either. And had he died, then that probably would have been an event on a par with the death of JFK. But as it stands, he survived. The world carried on pretty much as it has been, and so there you see a situation where you have two very, very similar events which happened to have different outcomes, and then end up, the JFK's been is one of the big names when it comes to conspiracy theories, really, and has been ever since the 60s. Whereas I'm aware of a single conspiracy theory around the shooting of Ronald Reagan, as people have pointed out, that John Hinckley Jr.'s father, I assume John Hinckley Sr., ran the who was it, Vanderbilt Energy Concern or something. He was the Hinckley's were known to the Bushes, for one thing, were big in Texas, and people had always sort of drawn the insinuation that had Hinckley successfully killed Reagan, then George Bush Sr., who was vice president at the time, would have become president then. And it's all, it's a fairly feeble as far as conspiracy theories go, and that's it. That's the only thing that sort of gets any mention. And the contrast between the two, which otherwise, aside from the ultimate outcome, two very similar events, and yet one generates tons of conspiracy theories and the other one doesn't, simply because of the ultimate impact it had on society and politics as a whole. I did like the point, I'm not sure if this has come up before when we've talked about it, the idea that when talking about conspiracies and how long it takes conspiracy theories to become mature, the idea that it's actually possible for conspiracy theories to be mature almost straight away if they are variations on or things which plug into existing conspiracy theories. And we see a lot of with a lot of the sort of the QAnon stuff is just sort of a rehash of the Satanic Panic, which is a rehash of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion or what have you, and a lot of the critical race theory stuff we see going around at the moment is just an echo of conspiracy theories that have come before. So you can sort of say that while it may take some time before you want to say that certain conspiracy theories are mature, and the fact that they are mature, unwarranted conspiracy theories is a problem, for other ones you can pretty much say from the outset, well, this is really just more of the same, and we can essentially count it as an unwarranted, mature conspiracy theory pretty much from the get-go. And finally, what's this about a Swedish art project that M just casually happens to mention? Oh yes, I've been contributing to some art project about the faked moon landings or something happening in Sweden. What's going on there? More questions, as if we didn't have enough already for the good Dr. Dentith whenever we managed to track them down. But that has not happened yet, so we'll keep you up to date. We'll see if we're lucky, maybe more of these interviews will materialise in our shared Dropbox, and I'll be able to share them with you, good listeners. But otherwise, we'll just have to keep guessing. So until I, or who knows, both of us, talk to you again, all I can say is goodbye.
The Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy is Josh Addison and me, Dr. M.R.X. Dentith. You can contact us at podcastconspiracy@gmail.com, and please do consider supporting the podcast via our Patreon. And remember, the truth is out there, but not quite where you think you left it.